In today's episode, I'll be talking about my business story, and you'll find out how I ended up sleeping in a sleeping bag next to my Steelo, how I made my first delivery on a bike, and also my epiphany when it comes to running a business. If you would like to find out how I got to starting my business, then I really recommend you listen into the episode about my personal story. So here I'll start off when I've already launched my company. So initially the inquiry levels were very poor. And now when I mean poor, I mean very, very. I did not have a single inquiry for about 8 weeks. So when I started on the 1st of September 2009, I was convinced that when I open my doors, just put an ad here and there, people will be flooding through the doors and windows. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Now, back then in 2009, the internet wasn't really a big thing, so the places where you could advertise was obviously Yellow Pages, but then also the first platforms were called either Silex or Applegate. So they unfortunately failed, but they were the places to advertise as you would on Yellow Pages. So the thing that I really wanted to stick with was a promise to myself that I won't poach any of my previous employers' customers. Like I really owed them everything I knew about business to them, and it just felt to me unfair if I did that. So that wasn't necessarily a good thing for hitting the ground running when it comes to starting a business. But to me, the ethics are more important than just chasing money. So that explains why it was so slow, even though I was very good at what I was doing, but I basically had to start from scratch. Now, the first inquiry I had was for like some small frames. They were to support like an advertisement or something. And initially, my whole plan for the business was to be a management company. In fact, the name of the company was Struck Steel Steelwork Management. Struck Steel was me trying to be clever and combine two words, structural and steel, with a then fancy X. It was a disaster. People didn't know how to spell the name of the company. They couldn't send an email because of it. So it was really, really tricky. Nevertheless, I wanted to be a management company. Therefore, I wanted to find projects in London, manage the design part or do it myself, outsource the fabrication somewhere up north where rates are cheaper, and then manage the logistics and installation. Now, bear in mind that when I started the business, it was the middle of a recession. I didn't know what a recession was. I mean, the world continued for me as normal, whereas it made a massive impact on the large companies, the ones that I actually tried to target. So despite my 9-month planning in terms of writing the business plan with all the P&Ls forecasted and balance sheets and all of that, that went all out of the window. On top of it, I hired a tiny room in Hammersmith in a office block because I didn't need the facilities to fabricate steel. And actually, I asked to have the cheapest possible room, and the one that they offered me was a room without windows because it was a room used for storage before, which was fine with me. I mean, it was the way I wanted to start was to save money everywhere I could, which is now something I really advocate for and sort of suggest to others who are thinking of starting their own business. So I started off in this small office. On day one, I remember I was as proud as it gets. I genuinely thought that the hard work was over, that the 9 months that I've spent on preparing a business plan and all of that, it will pay dividends from day one. But as mentioned, I could not have been more wrong. So anyway, the first order came in. It was a bit of a disaster. I had to outsource it to someone else to make it and then arrange for a collection in this office block. Like it just did not make sense. I lost money on it because the outsourcing of it cost the same as I charged the customer, because I was so desperate for the first customer. So those were the sort of humble beginnings. And then I had an order for a whopping £57.50, and I've actually got a photo of the check. Yes, those days of checks where you had to get a piece of paper that says I owe you whatever the number, you then submit it to the bank and then wait 3 to 5 working days before you actually have access to the money. So in terms of cash flow, it was a disaster. It almost pulled me down at some stage later. But I received that payment as a check, and it was for a longish steel plate, so it's just over 1 meter. Now, in those days, I was saving on everything, especially with my experience now that people aren't necessarily flooding my office. So I had to really pay attention to my expenses. And when I had my office in Hammersmith, I used to work on the other side of the River Thames in Barnes, which is sort of close to Roehampton and Putney. So, in order to save money, I cycled to work, because if I drove, then I would have to pay the car park fee and all of that, and I would be losing more money. And with this tiny order for £57.50, obviously there was no margin for me to deliver. So, however, a delivery was agreed. So I quickly done the maths in my mind, and I just thought, well, stuff it. I'm going to deliver the steel piece on my bike. And I had this road bike with very, very thin tires, aluminium frame, so it was nice and silvery, shiny. I strapped the steel to this bike using sort of tape or gaffer tape. It was sticking out both ends. It must have looked hilarious, but that is what I could only afford. Now, knowing that this is not what the customer would like to see, actually would have been very embarrassing, I decided to leave much earlier. And indeed, I left earlier, but as soon as I got on my bike, I realized that the added weight, probably was like 20, maybe 25 kilograms, made a massive difference on the tires. The tiny tires were being squashed, they were almost screaming, they were almost flat when cycling. So I had to go very, very slowly so that I don't get a puncture. The last thing I wanted was to have a puncture with that steel and being stuck in the middle of the road and not being able to deliver this piece to my customer. So I had to go much slower. Unfortunately, the buffer that I've allowed for was eaten up, and I arrived just before time, but unfortunately the customer was before me waiting there. So I was like, oh no, like this is the disaster scenario where the customer will see me delivering the steel on a bike. His look was priceless. It was like a shock, but like he didn't know what to say basically. We then laughed it off, saying, oh yeah, I just found it was going to be quicker, like not having to stand in traffic and all of that. But the fact is that the first delivery of steel in my company was done on a bike. So those are the beginnings. So if you are starting out in a garage or in your bedroom and so on, that's completely fine. You are still able to make it big time, as long as you stick to a few business rules, and on top of it, if you're really passionate about what you do. So fast forward, like orders started coming in and so on. Nevertheless, I was losing money. And there came a point where I literally ran out of money. I was renting a room back then, and I simply could not afford to pay the upcoming rent. I was so desperate that I even considered going into McDonald's. Like, I wasn't aware, I just thought you can turn up in the morning, ask for a job, and get paid at the end of the day. But it was a time where my whole life plan was at risk. I was in business, and here I was faced with the potential of it going under. So unfortunately, I was so stressed that for a week I didn't sleep. And when people told me before that you simply just can't sleep, I was like, well, what are you talking about? Like, what's so difficult in sleeping? You put your head on a pillow and nod off. Like, really? Why can't you fall asleep? But unfortunately, I experienced the same. And indeed, when you are stressed to the limit, you just can't sleep. For me, I was just lying in bed staring at the ceiling, and before I knew it, it was becoming brighter again. It was time to get out of bed. So I know what it means to be chronically stressed to the core, basically. But in that moment, I just thought, no, I'm going to allow myself one more day. I can't allow all my vision and plans for the business to just evaporate only because I can't pay the rent. So in the morning, I quickly jumped out of bed. I printed out this, what to me looked like a nice looking leaflet. It was probably terrible. It was printed in black and white because that was the only printer I had in my room, on A4 sheets. And I just printed basically some information about what I do with some contact details. What I did next is I started walking from building site to building site, knocking on doors and asking for the project manager or the site manager. It's easy to spot building sites because there are three giveaways. It's either a skip, a scaffolding, or a portaloo. So you can see them from far away, and I just walked in and had a chat and so on. And that was a turning point. One of the customers, who was actually very close to my office block in Hammersmith, was actually on Hammersmith Grove, a few numbers up. He placed an order because he needed steel, and because he was also Polish, we sort of built this rapport straight away. And I must have said something or appeared trustworthy because he paid a deposit, and I desperately needed that money to pay the rent initially, to pay for materials, and then have everything done, delivered, and paid for. So that is how low I got. I really thought I'm going to have to close the business, which is, hindsight, was great because it allowed me to experience what it feels like to be at your lowest low, not only personally but also as a business. Now, when it comes to the work that I did, I'm not a welder, so I never welded any of the connections, but I did all the other works like drilling holes and painting and also delivering. But what happened in the meantime was that I realized that the only way I can actually grow this business is to backtrack with my management company plans and go into fabrication myself. It's not the route I really wanted to go down because I knew it's going to be a lengthy route before I grow this business and so on. It's going to be a few years, but so be it. It was out of necessity that I had to go down that route. So I found this garage in Isleworth, west part of London, and that is where we started fabricating steel. Now, I didn't employ anyone initially because I couldn't afford it, so I only got the guys from my previous employer after their work on the way back home. They used to pop into mine and do an hour or two, sometimes 4 hours of work, sometimes late into the evening. So I paid them only for the work done, and that was the best way to structure a business in terms of cash flow and not having a budget whatsoever. This meant hard work for me because they only did the welding and I did all the painting and so on. Now, in this garage, which was raised from the floor level because it was prepared for loading sort of vans and so on, so it wasn't at ground floor, it was all elevated, but that meant real hard work when it came to lifting and moving stuff. Steel, structural steel, as you can imagine, is very heavy, and without any lifting means you're down to body muscles and also using leverage, as in a stick or a pole and then supported on something that provides leverage, which allows you to lift a bit and then add a joist or something underneath to maintain that lifted height. So it was really hard work. This also meant that the painting was left for me, and because I started in September, when all of this was happening, it was sort of winter time. So it was cold, it was rainy, so I had to close the shutters, or at least have them almost closed just for some ventilation. And as you can imagine, the paint, the fumes from the paint was very detrimental and affected me. After some time, after painting, I could see green spots and everything was swirling around. So when I drove back home, I really didn't feel comfortable on the road. Like I was really struggling to see what's ahead. So that's how bad it was. I was probably hallucinated by the fumes. But again, that's necessity. Like I had no other option. That was just me. I was alone in the UK starting off a business. So I just had to fight through it and make it work. Then there came a time where we had a bigger order, or I had a bigger order. I still relied on this temporary workforce that just popped in when needed. And they fabricated a big job. It was probably like, I don't know, 8 or so beams, heavy beams, and they finished quite late at night. So there was no point me putting all the steel work into the garage or asking them to do it. Not only because I couldn't afford them, but then also in the morning I would have access to a forklift from one of our neighbors. So we left it outside, and I turned up in the morning and there was no steel. I was like, okay, I do hope that it is the landlord that kindly came up very late at night, saw the steelwork and put it inside his unit. So I went over to his unit, the shutters were opened, and there was nothing there. They didn't have the steel as well. So I went over to him. I just kind of was hoping that he had this secret place where he could put the steelwork away in a safe place. So I went to him and said, do you know where the steelwork is? And he was like, what steel? I'm like, oh shit. Turned out that at 6:03 a.m, 3 blokes turned up in a white transit van, jumped out, loaded the steelwork as if it was made out of feathers, and drove off within minutes. It was all caught on CCTV. They did have balaclavas, so they were prepared for it, and in that moment, my steelwork was gone. To me, it was a disaster. I had to pay up front for materials. I did not have any credit lines with our suppliers. I did have another project that was paid for using a check. The first application for the money was rejected. The check bounced, so I had to reapply for a payment. That meant I didn't have the money for a previous project, and the deposit for this project I've already spent on the material in the first case, plus the labor that I had to pay for to fabricate the steelwork. And here I am on delivery date, no steel. So I called the customer saying, look, it's an awkward situation, but your steel's been stolen. He didn't believe me. he thought it's a made up story, but the truth is the truth. And I used my last kind of money available on the account to pay the next lot of materials, and really it was redlining a cash flow. I somehow managed to pay my guys. I delivered the steelwork a few days later and got paid for it. Then one of the bounced checks actually got paid, so I rebounded quite quickly. But that moment wasn't enjoyable at all. What happened next, though, is that with these kind of projects, the large ones that didn't necessarily fit into the garage or was pointless spending the time loading it, they were left outside, but this time I was well prepared. I was sleeping next to my steelwork in a sleeping bag, equipped with a knife and a baseball bat. Now, I know this sounds horrible, but that was the reality back then. I was furious. With all my training, these special forces that I was almost about to join, with all my martial arts and all of that, I just wanted revenge. I had the fitness to do it, I had the skills to do it, but luckily this never happened again, because I was just fuming. I had so much bad energy in me that this probably wouldn't have finished well, either for them or for me, because at the end of the day there were 3 of them. Nevertheless, I kept on sleeping next to my steelwork because this was my lifeline. This was my bread. This was what provided a roof above my head in terms of paying my personal rent. So that is how precious the goods were for me. Now, it was obviously very frustrating, but at the same time, it was very exciting. I did a lot of crazy tours and stuff in mountains, sleeping in snow caves and so on, and I just treated it as a adventure. I was like, well, wow, now I'm sleeping outside in this snow and all of that, but fine, I'm kind of this security guy keeping my steel. So that's also a very interesting experience. And then I must say that I kept scratching my head because I knew that this is all unsustainable. Like I'm doing all these crazy stuff. Like you can't have run a proper business by sleeping next to your steel. Like you can't micromanage temporary workforce in the afternoon stroke evenings to somehow make your products and then deliver and all of that. It just didn't feel like I can build a solid company on these foundations. So I really queried, like, what am I doing wrong? Like, what is it that's not working? On top of it, above where we were, it was the approach to Heathrow runway, the left runway onto 27. So if you're flying in from the east, and every now and then there was this plane which had the writing on it as Virgin Atlantic. So when it comes to all the national airlines, I know that they lose money and they're not there as a business, they're there to generate, to get the economy moving. So you have people traveling, spending money on their vacation, and also business people meeting up at different places, sort of agreeing deals. So it's used there to get the economy going. But then with Virgin Atlantic, I knew that this is in private hands, so it must make money. And I knew that Richard Branson, who's the owner, he was not the pilot on board because he couldn't have been, because there were a few of those planes airborne at any given time globally. He wasn't sitting in the air traffic controller, he wasn't handling the luggage, he wasn't on board as cabin crew, and I just thought, what is he doing differently? How come he can have a few planes flying around the world while he's sitting on his own island? At the same time, I was thinking, well, he doesn't have 10 heads, he doesn't have 20 hands or 20 legs. And also, in terms of IQ, yes, he's very intelligent, but it's not that he's like 10 times more intelligent than Einstein was. So it's something else. It must have been the mindset or something that I didn't quite get back then. Nevertheless, I just continued. Like I didn't have any other option. I didn't have time actually to think how I can change things because things started to move. So I was getting more inquiries and I actually became a workaholic. But then one day I went to a business networking event organized by Barclays Bank at Twickenham Stadium. So I walked in, as you would expect. I'm sure you've been to these networking events where when you turn up early, there are a few people, they kind of start to mingle and chat each other. And there were some nice looking tables with this white table covers on them, lots of glasses, a choice of wine, red and white, and a lot of other sort of nibbles to treat yourself to. So I walked over to one of those tables, and when pouring myself a glass of wine, I realized that I know one of the guys there. So I quickly went over to him and said hello. His name was Giovanni. Now, I knew Giovanni from a completely different area of life because we both belonged to a panel of frequent users of Richmond Park in London. We used to meet up once a month, discuss it with the ranger, with the police and other frequent users about the safety, about what's going on in the park, and they were basically asking frequent users like me to join so that we can share our experiences. And I knew him from there, although we never chatted more than just hello and maybe talk about using the park. But because we were both in a business networking event, well, we obviously started talking about business. It turned out that Giovanni, who was obviously dressed very well as was a typical Italian guy, black hair, dressed to the back with this smart suit and tie, everything was crisp, so very good looking, and turned out that he's very, very wealthy. Most of the horses that actually are in Richmond Park and Wimbledon Common were his, and also quite a few prominent properties around that area are also his. So when I told him about my experience, that I actually started from scratch and I'm actually an immigrant from Poland and I had to knock on doors and so on, he stood there for a moment, sort of patted me on the shoulder and said, "Do you know what, Michael? You are going to be very successful." I'm like, "Okay, well, thank you." He said, "Because if you have the guts to walk the street and knock from building site to building site, you will make it. It might be tough, but you will make it. So that was all good, but unfortunately, that was not the silver bullet. I didn't know how I'm going to make it. What I knew is that I was working crazy hours. I was working sometimes literally 24 hours. Sundays didn't matter. If a customer wanted to meet up on Sunday or call me on Sunday, I was there. All my private plans went aside. There was nothing like my hobbies anymore, despite me taking part in a lot of races beforehand. Now simply wasn't the time. I did not have that time, or in other words, I didn't have the mind space to be involved in anything else than thinking how I can somehow escape my trap made by myself in my own business. So when chatting to Giovanni, he said, do you know what? You should read this book called The E-Myth. I'm like, okay, I actually got that book at home. So as soon as the event finished, I got back home and I started reading it. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't believe that someone wrote a book about me, or at least that's how it felt. I couldn't believe that all those questions I had about Richard Branson, about how is it that I only have 2 employees, yet I'm working crazy hours and all that, are actually covered in a book. That someone must have been through exactly the same and that they were willing to share that knowledge. So I started reading and I couldn't finish. I literally spent the night reading it. I then had to go to work, obviously tired, but excited that there is a way. At least I could see the light in the tunnel. I then continued reading in that afternoon and I finished the whole book in one night and then an afternoon. And I was so excited. And the thing that excited me then was the idea and the fact that a company should work without the owner. This became my epiphany. This became a pivotal point in my life, not only on my business journey, but in everything that happened. Bear in mind that I was in a very low position then. I was starting to earn very good money, but I was working relentlessly every single day. I got married. It was unfortunately almost like a forced marriage because I knew that I'm approaching 30, so I have to sort of get married and have a child. But unfortunately, we then had to sort of have a funeral of our baby. It didn't make it. It was a stillbirth, so it was a terrible experience in itself, carrying a small coffin and seeing the mom of a child weeping over a coffin. So that was terrible. But it definitely made me stronger in life. And that is also the reason why I became so excited about the prospect of escaping it. That there is a way, that there's a solution to all my problems. And the only solution is that your company should work without the owner. And here I am, building a company around myself. I was the company. I was the person that every customer knew. I was the person that managed every single aspect of the business. And that, unsurprisingly, led to the horrible situation I found myself. But now I knew that there is a way. And I was desperate to make it all happen. I started implementing the things I've learned from the book, and it kind of worked. I was like, yeah, I'm excited on one hand, but on the other hand, I can see some drawbacks. Like this isn't working and that, yeah, I get the idea, but I just don't know what the extent should be of it or how do I actually implement it and so on. So initially, I had all the excitement in the world, but then after a few weeks, I was like, all my hopes are unfortunately becoming buried. Like this is not really working the way I thought it's going to be. On top of it, I was being ridiculed. Anne, who was a secretary for one of the next door companies, she used to come out for a smoke every now and then one day she just came out, started smoking, looks at me with her arms crossed and was like, Michael, you're becoming big-headed. Which was... it really hit me hard because what I was trying to be was trying to be the owner that runs a proper business, not the guy rushing around like a headless chicken, but someone that's trying to see the company from above, someone who's working on the business rather than inside the business. So she could see the shift. On top of it, she actually was also so kind of made friends with my employees. I had 2 employees back then, and they said, "Oh, Michael, you're becoming arrogant." And like, gosh, like, okay, so be it. Like, if that's the way they see it, then I guess that's part of the journey, the part of the transformation. But the thing is that I did not receive positive feedback, even though I was excited about the prospect of making things differently. This kind of feedback was like a thorn. It just did not help. And above all, I did not manage to implement what I wanted to do or what was covered in the book. So I carried on and I was still working very hard. I kind of knew that this is not the way, but I didn't know another way. I just had to continue. And then finally, it was again a difficult moment, whatever it was. I just thought, okay, I do need to get someone's help. I need a mentor, a coach. So I reached out to the E-Myth organization, and actually when I read the book, I thought that's it. The author was just willing to share his knowledge, but actually I then realized that there's a whole mastery course. So I applied. I was told it's going to cost, I think it was like £1,000 a month, and I'm like, oh my God, like I can't afford this training. But I just thought it's either going to work or I'm going to fail. And if I fail at this stage, that's fine. I've given it a go. I just could not imagine working like this forever. It would kill me. It already has. It's killed my relationship. It's killed my baby. I was a shade of my own self, and I knew that I just can't continue like this. So I gave it a go, and indeed it worked. I started implementing the things relentlessly as advised by my coach. We met up weekly. It was all done online. And because of the fact that I had to check in every week and report as to what has been done, what has worked, what hasn't, that really kept me going until I reached a point about probably 8-9 months later where indeed the company was able to operate without me. That allowed me to grow from like 6 employees to 23 over 2 years. The growth was just immense. Like we had month after month with better results. In the long term, we had 34% average growth year on year for 12 years. So you can imagine that, in other words, in terms of turnover, we grew from just over £500,000 per month to 10 million in 10 years. Now, this is obviously not an overnight success, but looking back, it feels like an overnight success because 10 years, looking back, just fades into a portion of time, not necessarily 10 years. So I'm very proud of it. It allowed me to uncover a whole different level of being a business owner. Instead of being the centerpiece, the hard-working business owner that I was able to look at the company from above. I was able to grow it strategically, think about the next steps. Who do we need to hire next? What customers do we need? What KPIs do we need? What sales need to be? Obviously, that was all done in an as automated way as possible, so every salesperson knew exactly what the target was. Then looking for new premises, we built our own IT system that managed all the processes within the company. So I really discovered this hidden gem, something that isn't taught at universities or elsewhere. It's something that is almost like underground information. And I was so proud that through my horrible experiences, I was so desperate that I did find this hidden gem of knowledge. And as you now know, this is my purpose, this is my mission. I just love the fact that you can convert a business so that it can work without the owner and any other employee, as a matter of fact, because the company should work on systems as the backbone and people are added to it to run those systems. So now my mission is to help you do the same, grow your business through all of these steps so that you can become the true entrepreneur that focuses on strategic growth and thinking of new opportunities, either within your current sector, elsewhere, maybe even in a different country, but the world is just waiting for you to explore it. So that is why I am so passionate about the Stand Back to Grow movement, because this is basically my experience. I've been at the lowest low. It was really, really bad, as you've heard. And I know how detrimental it is to other business owners. To me, it is a massive waste of opportunity and talent if business owners, the creative ones, the entrepreneurs of the world, are stuck in running their businesses only because they don't know the idea that the company should work without the owner. So this is my journey through business. I obviously then escaped the business altogether. I managed to sell it, which was a great experience in itself, and it allows me to not only now fly my own plane and have time for my family and children, but also to dedicate my time in helping you be successful and scale faster your business.